on the record. There you go. Hey, everybody, if you weren't here, now we're talking on the record. You should have heard the stuff we talked about before the record. Woo, man. So it is the summer. It is July. It is book study day. We are a small yet powerful group today. Our goal is to take anyone watching this video and make you mad that you missed it today. That's the goal. It's a simple, petty goal, but yet it's a goal just to save now. Hopefully, we will have some good information to share about this book. This book is really, really very good. I really am enjoying this book. Hi, Vicki. It's just my Post-it notes just keep exploding out.
Yeah.
And I love it. I think it's great. So we had for today chapters 7 and 8. Like I had mentioned, we're almost done with the book. Chapter 7, talking about finding common ground. Chapter 8, talking about redirecting toxic words and emotions. Who wants to lead us down a path? What would you like to talk about first?
I'll just start by saying that these 2 chapters, I think, were the ones that I've been needing the most. I think when someone says ask better questions, you can do that pretty quickly. You can foster dialogue. You can open things up a bit more, but finding common ground and trying to steer away from toxic relationships, that happens more inadvertently than we'd want it to. And just by listening to other people talking, or, if I'm in a coaching session, I'll hear someone start to gossip or throw someone under the bus. And it's going to be really great to now have these strategies to steer the conversation. And I personally liked, I was looking at staying silent is one of the strategies to avoid being toxic.
Oh my God, I'm so glad you said that. That's on my Post-it note. I said, I wrote to myself because I have tried to do that. And it's interesting. I think that's so funny that resonated with you too. I think when you do a lot of talking, and so I do a lot of talk. I talk all the time. I think that silence of not talking is so telling in those situations. Carolyn, that's so funny that grabbed you too. I wrote that in big words. Remain silent is what I wrote on my note card here. I think that's awesome. So let's talk about that one. We'll talk about chapter 8, and then we'll work our way back to 7. Or we'll weave the both of them in. Who cares? We'll do what we want. It's our hour or however long we talk. So anybody else thoughts about chapter 8, which was that redirecting toxic words and emotions?
I think the tactics, I'm looking at page 174, and I think the tactics that they provided, interrupt, name, correct, and divert, I think those are all really helpful, but I think it's going to take a lot of practice to help make it seamless. Sorry. See, now everyone's jealous they're not here because I got to hear my dog Kindle. Barking.
Yeah, I'm on Kindle and I don't have a page number, so it's got to be more.
I have this guy. That's
Okay,
what I'm
thank you.
Yep. So it's in chapter 8. But thinking about, interrupting, cutting off the negative conversation before it begins, like, oh, I'm late, I gotta go. Like, that could seem more obvious to some people, especially if they are looking to be ranting that day, if you will. And same thing with diverting. Like, I feel like the diversion, like, it's always great, but it's also very obvious when it's like, oh, cool, you're talking about this. Speaking of that, let's totally turn you this other way.
Speaking of that, let's not speak about that.
Right.
Let's go do something else.
Yeah.
That it's a problem for it to be obvious. Like, honestly, I don't want to talk about that.
Yeah.
It's
so interesting. Do you think, Vicki, in your thought about that, because I agree with you, I think there's a point that I would just be like, look, that's not what we're here to talk. We're not interested in that right now. Do you think that comes with, do you think that kind of comfort level of doing that comes with experience? So you have to work yourself. Do you think you would have been that same way 5 years ago?
5 years ago, yes. 10 probably
10 years ago? No.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you get that sort of pressure socially to kind of like to make sure you're fitting in and saying the right thing. So I think it does take a certain amount of confidence or general disregard for social pragmatics to be like, yeah, I don't want to talk about that right now. We're gonna move on.
Yeah. Yeah. The other tactics they mention on that page is to name it, describe what's going on so everybody can say, just flat, put it out there, which I think again starts to take it starts to take that, it puts a spotlight on it and it forces us to acknowledge it and then perhaps move forward from it, like Vicky says, is that okay, that I see that. What do you think,
But like,
Vicky?
I can absolutely see that my grad students wouldn't necessarily have the confidence. Most of them would probably not have the confidence to kind of do this right now. But I'm just cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
As someone that's young, I think that's so valid. Like
Yeah.
that's so valid. It's kind of like not knowing what your place is and not knowing if you can say something about that, or the fear of, especially with people your own age, at my age, being
Mhm.
like, oh, if I say something, the next thing you know, then they're all going to think that I'm this or I'm that. And now all of a sudden, now I'm not included in any conversation, whether it's a good conversation or a toxic conversation.
And so what's a strategy then, Peyton? What makes sense to you? Is it the silence part that makes sense?
I would say that for myself personally, I do tend to take a silence approach. If it gets to the point where it's too much, I think that just the person that I am, I tend to call it out. I tend to say, like, this is what we're doing right now and it's not helping. Like, this is what we really should be focusing on, because I think that a lot of those types of conversations, at least in my day-to-day life, happen at the most inopportune times where I need to do something else or I need to get another task done.
Yeah.
And then I'm saying, okay, well, I'm wasting my time now. And this conversation is wasting my time. Like, otherwise, I would probably say that I'm kind of the person that if I don't have anything to do with the conversation and it's not benefiting me or I don't need to stick around for it, I pretty much just remove myself from said conversation, just because it's easier than causing a problem where I don't feel the need to stick around, if that makes sense.
Makes sense.
I think part of that goes back to establishing the norms, right? So if it's just something that we are here, we have a limited amount of time, we respect each other and their thoughts. However, this is what our goal is for this meeting, this conversation, this whatever. I think we could hopefully start to curb a lot of those toxic conversations from even happening, because the more we say, you know, hey, we're not here to talk about that, or this isn't going to be valuable for our time today, the more people will recognize coming to this meeting, we are going to stay on track. And there is a time and place to vent. But venting is different than trying to totally commandeer a meeting and then just spend our hour venting and complaining and not getting anything done.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. I think when we have stuff that we do with people over time, you have a chance to do more of that. And when I think about this chapter, the thing that strikes me is that this is one of those one-hit things. You go into a group, or maybe you are fresh to a group that is already defined. They might already have their norm, and unfortunately, their norm might be toxic. And so now we have to come in and start to redirect that. And then, focus that energy onto a positive track with that group. And that could be really difficult. And it could easily steamroll. One of the questions that came out of the workbook was, a couple, how easy is it for you to redirect a toxic conversation? So just a little self-reflection there. Do you remember a time you failed to redirect, and what could you do in the future to redirect? I think that this whole chapter brings up those times where it went horribly wrong. Where maybe it was a time where I thought it was probably I was ill prepared for the level of what a conversation was that I stepped and dropped myself into, and then wasn't fully prepared on how to navigate through that and what were some of the skills that needed to be employed to get people going forward. I can remember a time where I had to bail out completely of something. And I said to a group, I don't know that I'm the right person to lead you or to work with you, because I don't know if you want to necessarily work with me. And that's cool. I mean, that's well, it's not cool. It is what it is. But that's a really interesting conversation too, because I don't know that there's anything more naming it than that. And saying, look, I see where you're at, and that's not where I'm at. So we can't be together. And then what do you do? And in the case of this group, they moved on to another person, which was fine. I mean, they found someone who was better fitted for them, and which was great for them. I don't know that they made any strides. I don't know. I didn't work with them after that, so I don't know. But it was the ultimate naming it and putting it right out there. Like, this is just not going to work for any of us here.
I think
Other things that grabbed you in this chapter.
I'm like watching to see if other people are unmuted, and like Lori and Vicky are. So I'm like, I'm going to say something, but cut me off if not, because I see that you guys are unmuted too. Something that kind of came up, Mike, when you were talking about your reflection, is I was then able to go back with some of our AT Journey teams, and I was like, I saw Mike do that. I figured out how to do that. So also going back to, you asked Vicky, 5 years ago, would you have done this? Or Peyton spoke up saying, I'm not there yet, but like, I'm seeing it. And I think part of all of this is modeling how to redirect these toxic conversations, because, 10 years ago, I was fresh out of grad school. I didn't know what I was doing. And I wouldn't have the gumption that I do now. Then seeing people do it and feeling like, oh, that's the nice way of redirecting it. We're not trying to sit here and call people out personally. It's just, here's what this thing is. We're going to move away from that. So I think, hopefully the people who are part of this book study and are reading this are walking the walk now, not just, oh yeah, this book's great. Like, I learned some good strategies, but I'm never going to do them. I don't see that in this group specifically.
Right.
The people who aren't here though, not just kidding.
Yeah.
But I think having these models and now knowing these strategies, it's hopefully, one day toxic conversations won't be as present. Like they'll exist, they'll pop up, but it'll be a rare occurrence rather than, I'm sure all of us can think of a few different teams that we've had to redirect some of these conversations.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, and I think it's a totally reasonable strategy if it's becoming a toxic environment for you and you can't, that's a very reasonable strategy to walk away.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say that I'm not the right person for this.
Yeah.
And
And that, Vicky, is what I said to that group, is I put it back to me. I was like, I'm not the right person for your group. I'm not saying your group is wrong, even though I kind of am saying your group is wrong. But I'm not saying your group is wrong. I'm saying I'm not the right person that's going to help you as a group move forward. And call it what it is. I think that's, I think it's important to be honest with people throughout. That's going to get you to that point where a group will bring you in, that honesty. We've talked about that throughout, the idea of being very upfront with people. One of the things I wrote on my card, so I didn't have to flip through my book, and in my book in a Post-it note, was addressing the words and not the person, not making things this personal attack to other people, but what I hear you saying is, what I'm hearing from the group is, and that is that's part of that, putting it out there. Like, okay, here's what I hear. You tell me. Am I not getting it right? Is this what we as a group believe? Is this how we're as a group going to move forward? What is happening now? And I think that's really important. I think, Carolyn, you said something really funny, this idea of, not pulling people, not calling people out in the group. Like, oh, this is, you're bad, you're good, whatever, this kind of thing. And I could think of a lot of instances. I can think, Carolyn makes me laugh because it makes me think of individuals we worked with in one of our teams, where we were trying so hard to get people to embrace a team concept and lose the concept of an expert, that we had to pull aside the expert in the group and try to enlist that person's energy to make the group move forward by relinquishing some of the expertness. I don't know that it went super well. It went okay. Yeah, there you go. Carolyn's half committed to it as well. It went okay. But we did pull that person aside to have that conversation.
Yeah, with that one specifically, I don't think the mentality changed. I think it was interesting for it to be brought to his attention. But I don't know if anything changed beyond that. But at least, we can still say, we've brought this to your attention. This is the way we're moving this. This is what we're here to do. This is why you guys partnered with us. If this is not something you are interested in, we do not have to partner. And it goes back to, that team decided to move forward on their own after that, which.
Yeah. And so they gave us their answer by that. And then so they said, we'll move forward without you. Thanks very much. And that's cool. That's fine.
I find it really hard it's just always been hard for me. I have communication difficulties, and just because it creates so much anxiety in me when I am dealing with confrontation. And I just wondered, how do I calm that down, and think rationally, not, I don't know. I have PTSD.
Yeah.
I broke my leg with.
I think Mary, this whole part is really tricky because this is about a reflection of on into yourself as to how comfortable you are with this. And that's why I asked Vicky if this is a result of time spent in the trenches per se, like if you get to this point. But I also think there is a component, Mary, that some of us are just more comfortable in that scenario than others, and to recognize that and to find a path around that. It does make it hard if you're not comfortable in that spot. I mean, we've all probably seen it. We've all probably seen a situation where you're in a professional learning experience and you watch a presenter get steamrolled by somebody in the audience, just steamrolled, and there is no coming back. I mean, you can see. And you all just shook your head. So clearly everybody's seen that. What happens in that environment after a steamrolling happens? Like, what do you see? How does the learning change in that environment after that? Vicky's still living in it right now. Vicky is in it.
There was a speech that I'm in Toastmasters at San Diego Toastmasters. It's a hybrid thing. And one of the best communicators did a speech Friday, and it was about estrangement and how to fight estrangement from families, estrangement from groups. And he said three things. One is positivity, second is openness, and third is working on tasks together, sharing tasks. So that kind of struck a chord in my head. And now when I have a conversation, I have my best friend in high school, she's brainwashed with the Trump stuff, and she just lost her dad, and it was a close friend of mine too, her dad, because I kind of just lived over there when I was a teenager. And so, I just stick that thing in my mind when I talk to her, and it just helps so much.
I think it's a really good way to think of it. Vicky, what'd you think of after you kind of lived in that for a minute, that experience?
So I think it partially had to do with the person didn't set those norms to start with.
The facilitator.
The facilitator didn't set the and we didn't have a sort of a meeting that was imposed as opposed to like a intentional team building kind of thing.
Okay.
And so it was a more skilled presenter, I think, could have turned it around.
Mhm.
But with that, and would have been like, oh, well, maybe this was not necessarily the situation that I thought I was coming into. Let's back up, kind of thing.
Right.
But this person didn't do that, and everything kind of derailed. And it was supposed to be much more productive and sort of like planning kind of thing, but instead it was everybody air grievances.
Right.
So I arranged my schedule so I was unable to attend future meetings because I was just like, this isn't going to be a productive use of anybody's time. Like, it's just, and that I think is sort of one of my issues with a particular workplace is that if you're going to call a meeting,
Mhm.
like, let us know what it's about first. If you want it to be this way, then you've got to set norms to begin with.
Mhm.
And if you're going to do team building kind of things, everybody's got to be on board for that.
Right.
And it feels like they're ignoring all of the things, all of the norms that have been like we know how to do this.
Right.
And
This isn't the first meeting that's ever happened, right? Yeah.
Right.
We know what should happen.
We
Yeah.
know what should happen, and there's no reason for this not to happen. So it's just, it gets frustrating.
Yeah, well, what about IEPs?
What about it? I mean, yeah, great. It's the same kind of idea. I mean, we're talking about this in the context of professional learning, but sure, we could talk about this in this context, in any context, we could talk about this idea. IEP meetings, and I think that isn't there a certain, and I'll go back to what Vicky just said. I can think of just a handful of IEP meetings off the top of my head that unfortunately the same structure as Vicky's. There was no real plan. Well, we have to meet, so let's meet. Okay, well, that's not a good reason to meet because we have to meet. But if we don't have anything we want to share or move forward, why are we really meeting?
Well, usually it's update the goals.
Yeah, right. But again, if you are you clearly defining why you're there? Are you creating an environment? Because we know that some of those meetings can be, I mean, to call some of those meetings toxic is an understatement. I think I've been in some that it's doing a disservice to the word toxic to call it toxic. That's the reality of some of them. So they're already starting from a place that it's an uphill battle from the start. Right? And so I think in those, you need even a more skilled facilitator for that. And unfortunately, a lot of times we don't get that. You get people that were thrust into this position of making this work. We got to do this. We got to get this signed. We got to get this
done. Let's get through this. And also, setting time limits on what people do, because I was in an IEP, was long-winded about math, and you're losing the family, and you have to include the family in the IEP.
Yeah, but again, and Mary, you're coming up with a great idea. This idea of imposing some kind of structure around your conversation, like, oh, let's all take a minute or two to describe, and then we'll move to the next part, laying that out to a group and saying, this is how the next little bit of time is going to go. We don't need to, you're not going to speak for 15 minutes. Give us a 2-minute nutshell of what you'd like to talk about. And then we'll come together as a group and we'll talk about all of these things and how we approach
That's
that
what I really learned at Toastmasters.
I mean, these are, right. It's and
it becomes first.
It's really funny because going back to what Peyton said about not always feeling comfortable in that situation, and people not feeling comfortable about necessarily addressing somebody who's gone down a rabbit hole and you can't get them out. sometimes even imposing a 2-minute limit on someone in a meeting is really uncomfortable for certain people. Nobody wants to be the timekeeper, yet someone needs to be the timekeeper. And it's that same kind of idea. What do you think, Caroline? So you had a moment.
I know, I'm thinking like, so I've had some interesting ones, to the point where a father of a student told me that I wasn't allowed to introduce hieroglyphics to his student, to his son, because we wanted him to learn sign language, but this was a 25-year-old who is not going to be off on his own independently. He's always going to have someone with him. But hieroglyph, it was, I got taken back to that one. And I think part of it too, something that I learned when I was working for that program, were meeting mechanics. And it takes it away from, I'm imposing 2 minutes for you and 2 minutes for you. It's very much, we're talking at the board. All ideas are good ideas. We're choosing the best idea. And I mean, I just, based on what I was listening to you guys talk about, this really goes back to chapter 2 in this book of the Better Conversations Beliefs. And yes, I think a lot of IEP meetings can be toxic, but what's the root cause of that? And I think a lot of it is the parents haven't like they haven't felt they've been listened to, or maybe the speech path feels that her voice doesn't mean the same as the veteran OTs or whatever, the teachers. So I think like this would be a really great read for administrators who are going to be facilitating these meetings, so that they know you can't catch them all, right? You can't prevent every meeting from becoming, tumultuous, if you will. But I think if some of these things were in place and the parent felt like he was going to be heard, for example, I'm thinking again of my hieroglyphic dad. Yeah. If he knew that I went to school for this, I understand some of the things. So can we maybe find that disconnect so that I'm not imposing something that you don't agree with? And also I'm not agreeing to sign language just to get you to sign the IEP, which I feel like sometimes we do, we do see things. And I think that would also prevent the need for advocates in some of those really hard moments, because again, a lot of it, the time it's, I don't feel that my needs are getting met. I'm not being heard. I'm trying, like, I know my son best, which yes, parents know their kids way better than I'm going to know them as a speech therapist, but also the classroom teacher knows some quirks and some nuances that maybe they're not seeing at home. So again, just kind of going back to those generic Better Conversations beliefs, is there something that can be set up as the norms of everyone here has expertise and your voice matters and we want to hear it? So it kind of takes off that pressure of, well, I'm going to try to hold the floor for 15 minutes so that you guys listen to me.
Right. Because that might be the only time I get to be listened to. So I'm going to take every second of that. And it kind of dovetails nicely into chapter 7. What you're talking about, this idea of finding common ground, and really kind of digging down into, we are more alike than different. And how can we find that, and how can we celebrate that in order for us together to move forward? And what does that look like? Some of the things I wrote here were that, look at the words you use. What are the words you're using? Are you using words that are inclusive of others and not exclusive of others? I always find that to be a really interesting conversation point. I know I've told this story, I think in this group, of getting a contract with a school. And I was on a temporary contract when I was consulting with them for 3 months to finish a year, to finish a school year. And then I was going to meet with the director to talk about it in the summer to see if they wanted to go forward for another full year of consulting. And when I got to June and I wanted to speak with her about it, she just kept finding ways to not meet with me. And I thought, well, that's not great. I can see the writing on that wall. That's not good. And so I just stopped in her office one day when I was in district, and I said, hey, I was here and I thought maybe we could have a conversation about what we thought from the past 3 months, and if this makes sense for us going forward to work together. And she said, well, that's great. Come on in and we'll chat. And I said, okay. And so I sat down, I said, I think we are doing great with this. I think it's really going well. And I think that we've made a lot of movement in these 3 months. through the teams in the different schools. And she said to me, I agree. We've already signed your contract for the next year. You're already gonna have your contract because of exactly what you just did. She said, when I asked the teams what they thought about working with you, they said the thing we like is that he never comes in and says, he always comes in and says, we and us, how are we going to do this? What can we do to move this forward? And they said, we think he's part of our team now. And she's like, well, that's good enough for me. And then it went forward. And so I really, this kind of words having power thing becomes really important for me, because we've all seen it in a meeting or a presentation where someone says a word and it tweaks you either in a good way or a bad way. And then it colors the entire rest of that interaction. And so I'm not saying we're all going to be perfect. I'm far from that for sure. But I think being aware of what those things might be, the words that we're choosing and how we're employing them throughout conversation becomes.
That's sharing tasks.
What's that?
That's sharing tasks.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Go ahead.
I love that they pointed that out, because I'll tell you, that was one of the first things I noticed when we were up at Sarah's old ISD. So the first time I had really ever seen you present with a group that I knew we were partnering with, that was something that I wrote down when I was like, he never says I. He always says we, and I've tried to adopt that working with the teams that I've been with, because I felt the impact of that. I was like, oh my gosh, like, it's not you are going to do this. We are going to do this.
None of it is I'm doing this. All of it is we. And so how do we get to that with the rest of these groups? And that's what makes that chapter 7 so powerful, is that it is this idea of, we are together in this. What is it that we have? They talk about the I care, interests, convictions, activities, roles, and experiences. That's the I care. And I think that, living in that and getting a sense from people. Now, if we're doing a one-off with a group, that might be a little harder to dig into. You might have to kind of make some assumptions there, and you might not have as much chance for that to breathe a little bit and to dig down deeper. But
you say that again: interests, activities, roles, and what?
It was the acronyms I care, and it's interests, convictions, activities, roles, and experiences.
And I think that's also a great way to make it clear that not everybody's got the same things. So I think too often we're going for consensus and everybody thinks the same thing, when that's not really that's not the goal of this. Right. Everybody's going to bring their own convictions, activities, roles, and experiences to the plate, and that's a good thing.
It is a good thing.
Everything to be the same.
That adds to the richness of that interaction. And I'm always interested when people get stuck on one thing, and it goes to what you just said, Vicki, that idea of when people can't get past, do you think like me? And they put some arbitrary, just kind of categorization on that, and I won't share what state I was in when I was presenting this. I was in the Midwest. How about that? I was there. I'll leave it as cryptic as possible. I was in the middle of the country. And as I was setting up for a presentation for the day, this was a one-off, one day, make something stick with a group. And I'm setting up first thing in the morning, and somebody comes up to me and introduces herself, and we're chatting for a minute as I'm hooking up computers and stuff like that. And she said, I need to ask you something before we start. Because this will decide whether I stay or not for the day. And I was like, wow, okay, let me stop setting up for a second. This is interesting. And she had said to me, again, this was an AT presentation. Let me put that in your mind one more time. We're talking about assistive tech. And this lady said to me, she goes, I need to know who you voted for in the last presidential election.
Oh my goodness. Really?
And I said, oh, okay, well, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm not interested in telling you that. That's my business. And why does that matter? well, I need to know because I need to know whether I can believe anything you say for the rest of the day. And again, this is one of those things, and going back to what Peyton said before, of maybe not having experience kind of scares you out of like, what would I do in that situation? When you're seasoned enough, I'd like to call myself seasoned enough. I said to her, well, then I think you should probably just go. Because I'm not going to tell you that. And if that's going to be your decider for the day, I don't know that you're going to get anything from this anyway. And I think it's really interesting. And she didn't even give a chance to find that commonality because there was one decider. You know, it wasn't I care. She didn't go through the whole, in her mind, there was no I care of all those things, because if she would have hung around, I guarantee we would have found some commonality in our convictions to helping people be successful using technology in the ways we believe of those things. And that other part that she imposed on all of it would have kind of dropped away, I would like to hope. Hopefully, I would hope so. And that's unfortunate because I think that we missed out on a good opportunity to have a nice connection there. You know, in case you're curious, she did in fact leave. She stayed till the first break and then she left. And that's fine.
I feel like you need to tell us which state it is. I at least need to know it's one of my people.
No, the state was Michigan. No, it was not. It was not one of your people. This is a one-off, and I was never invited back. Perhaps because I didn't align with their. I don't know why, but I just wasn't. Yeah.
I do think that it's fair to be like, there's like, when I do presentations around AAC or work with groups around AAC, like if you don't fundamentally believe that the kids that you're working with can learn, then you probably don't need to be here. I probably don't need to be here.
Right. But that isn't that part of that I care. That's kind of our convictions, where what we truly believe is about to happen. And you're right. If that alignment's not there, Vicki, that person's just not going to be. That might lead us to chapter 8 with toxic environments of this might become.
Yeah, and in which case I might choose, I don't necessarily want to be there if that's your attitude towards this. So for my mental health, we might be done here.
We're done here. There's a part of me that wants to be able to have gone back to that person and just said, look, I've packed up my computer for the day because I just didn't like the way this went. And I just got back in the car and I drove away. I didn't. I took it. I take that as a challenge. I dare you to stay at that point. Because I want to change your kind of thought of how this day could have gone.
I think that's the way that if you set the norms, if you kind of approach it that way, you know, the people who I've been connecting with are the center-based programs, the self-contained classrooms, the students with most complex needs. And I'll go in there saying, I know this content. You know your students, you know your learners. And so something I say might not exactly align with your learner at this point. I don't want you to take what I'm saying, you know, everything I'm saying is not like the Bible, you know, say what, well, let's talk about it. Let's push back. And that's where we end up having some really great conversations about, you know, physical prompting and hand over hand, because I wholeheartedly believe that we shouldn't be doing that with our students, especially when it comes to communication. But there are some classrooms that are still doing it. And so by saying and creating that safe space of, I'm here to help you help your students. I believe they can learn. I believe that we're all here for the same reason for them. Let's have this conversation of why or why not we're doing the things that we're talking about today. And it creates this.
And sometimes I think they don't realize that when we're sort of in that role of consultant, that we do want to have a conversation. I'm not just there to give you information. I'd actually like to have this conversation. Like, let's go through this. And the one classroom that I worked with a couple years ago that was still doing a lot of hand over hand, I was like, so what happens if you stop doing that? Like, I'm just asking, like, what happens if you don't do hand over hand and get that worksheet done? What happens? Like, what changes? What could you do instead? Like that, and it's absolutely that we had that as a dialogue, and that's what caused practices to change. If I had just come in and said all of that, nothing would have changed. But it took a couple of visits before they were comfortable understanding that it was a dialogue, not just I'm not here just to present to you.
Yeah.
And the dialogue piece is so important. They actually came up, it came up in chapter 8, and it made me very happy, where they talked about the 5 whys. You know, that model from Toyota, this idea of you just keep asking why, and kind of drilling down a little bit and drilling down. And that's such a good strategy for these kinds of conversations.
That's from
to
that
dig
book,
down.
coaching, that other book though. You keep asking, why do you think that? Or,
Why do you think that? There's
Yeah.
the coaching habit. There it is. Mine's on the shelf. But this idea of just
Yeah.
this strategy of asking why 5 times, you will get to a very, very good answer by that 5th time.
Mhm.
You've challenged that person to reflect a little bit on their belief.
That's where I think that 5 whys comes really great into play. One, we're learning what their thought process is and why they're thinking and doing, but also they might have that moment of, oh, just because someone told me to, versus, well, I've seen this in action and I know the studies behind it and this is why I'm doing it, or I've tried all these other things and those didn't work, so we found something that does work. And so yeah, it does get tedious when you just, well, why? And so why? But I mean, that's something that we need to get down to the root cause. And like Vicky, you were saying, if you would have just gone in to say, stop doing hand over hand,
Right.
it would have been, well, you're not credible. You don't know what I'm dealing with. Like it's in
Right.
the immediate, like us versus them mentality.
Exactly. The
You're
who the
against
heck are
each
you
other.
to tell me that?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Versus talking through of, well, what could happen?
Right.
You know, okay, so we're not getting the worksheet done. What do you think happens to the worksheet anyway? It just goes in the garbage.
Mhm.
And so how can we actually talk about what they learned, or what they want to write about, or what they want to talk about? So
Well, and it was also like a little bit of a mix of like providing information on here's what alternative pencils look like, because they hadn't thought about stuff
sure.
like that.
Yeah.
But it was just as much about getting to their belief of why they had to get a worksheet done as
And-
much as it was about, have you thought about other ways for them to write?
And that could be just as powerful, Vicky, right? Because you're asking questions that are leading them down a road that you're able to supplement their information with additional resources that make them think again deeper about this.
Yeah, and then
And
when I
that's a
went back to
powerful
that-
way to do that. It's
Yes, and when I
scaffolding.
went back to that classroom a few months later, they were was hand over hand completely gone? No, but it was so much better. And they actually had some of the flip books, the alphabet flip books, and they had like a keyboard out, and like hallelujah.
That's it. I mean, that's movement, right?
That's
It's
movement,
people
yes.
looking at other options for alternatives to finding a way to complete a task, which is awesome. That's what you want. And then there's an opportunity to drill down a little bit more. You know, what has worked well with this? What are other opportunities you could see in the room to use this strategy? How might this help the other learners in your room that haven't had a chance to use it yet? All those good questions. And again, more questions, right? No answers, just more
Right.
questions.
Yeah, and it absolutely started with me asking why repeatedly until they figured it out
Yeah,
themselves.
that's why I always say this is my favorite question, because it forces someone to be reflective onto what they're doing and dig down.
Yeah. And again, it's the better conversations piece. It's it brings our whole book down, like our whole book study, to a culminating circle right there.
You've
But
brought it
yeah,
all
I
back.
think you know, like you were saying, being able to ask those questions got you more to, okay, well, they have this belief that we have to do this worksheet, but also you were able to uncover that they don't have alternative pencils yet. So that's a different conversation beyond, oh, well, we have to get this done. This is how they write. And it's like, oh, well, let's chat about alternative forms.
Right. And that might not have come up if you didn't start
Right.
asking questions and probing a little bit and trying to
Mhm.
understand the kind of the framework of what they're doing in that learning space.
Well, and I get a lot of pushback on for partner assisted scanning stuff being like, well, there always has to be another person there. And I'm like, well, communication is usually between 2 people, so somebody's gonna be there anyway. B, if you're doing hand over hand, where are you? oh, right there. Okay, so let's
Right.
talk about this. Like that's I don't see this as a barrier. So let's keep talking about this until you realize it's not actually a barrier either. And then we can talk about the alternatives.
Yeah. As opposed to you coming in, Vicky, and saying, don't do that. Because who doesn't love that, right?
We had
incredibly-
that happen this year. From us saying, let's have conversations about it. This is why we're not doing hand over hand anymore. And how do we fade it out? What do prompts look like? And we had a team go back to their classroom staff to say, we're not doing hand over hand anymore, which then got escalated to the admin, which then got escalated back to us to say, what are you telling our people? Like,
Yeah.
not
You
that.
knew it wasn't good because you used the word escalated twice.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Listening for words, that's not a good word to hear twice.
But it did also showcase that, it seemed like we were saying, don't use physical prompting, whereas the state autism grant was saying, yeah, physical prompting is fine. So it turned into, again, an us versus them. Well, Start says this, but Alt Shift is saying this, which led Start and Alt Shift to have conversations saying, are you saying that? Because we're
Right.
not saying that, and we're not saying this either. And now we actually have a joint prompting statement that was approved from MDE. We got it pushed out, and we had parent support into that as well. So it was a sticky situation that ended up turning out to be something really great to talk about, before we do any sort of prompting, not even just physical prompting, before we do any sort of prompting, what do we need to be considering for these learners? And
Again, conversation, right? Asking
Yes.
questions, having a conversation,
Yes.
finding your common ground. Like, then I love that. Are you saying that? I'm not saying that. Are you saying that? No,
Right.
neither of us are saying that. Okay, great. Well, then that's
Yes.
perfect. Let's go forward.
Mhm.
It's just always interesting that this idea of the pumping the brakes every once in a while. Like, wait a second, like what's happening right now? What's going on here? Like, and
Mhm.
just having that understanding of figuring out, where we're at in this whole conversation. But, yeah, I love these. I could talk even more about these chapters. I love them. What else do you guys want to talk about these chapters besides how great they are? Besides how great they are.
I always wonder if Jim Knight just catches the recording later. Like,
No,
need
Jim
a
Knight, if
mood
you watch
boost.
the recording, I love this book. I will tell you that, and I would love for you to join us because it's fantastic. I think that one of the questions that stuck out for me, it's back to the toxic conversations, and I put a little star next to it. What can you do in the future to be better at redirecting toxic conversations? Like, are there some action steps we can all do to be better at this? Peyton, I'll challenge you right now because you put your camera back on. That's always a problem because then that gets you right into view and you're right underneath my square. So I'm staring right at you. Knowing that you're in that spot where you feel young as part of a conversation, is there a strategy you could take from this conversation and say, oh, next time I'm experiencing something like that, maybe I'll try this?
I do think that I'm going to utilize more of the call it out kind of method that you were talking about. Like, I really liked how when you were talking earlier, Mike, you said like, okay, well, that's not relevant right now, or like, that's not the topic at hand right now.
Mhm.
Like, just saying, even if it's not fully addressing what's being said, but saying like, oh, that's not really helpful right now because we need to be talking about this, not that.
Name it, acknowledge it. Like, oh, I hear what you're
Exactly.
saying, but yeah, I think that's a
Right.
good strategy.
Like,
right?
not really a need to regurgitate what's being said, but just saying that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I think
Well-
that that's really helpful. I think that that's something that I think I can do in a way that doesn't need to be aggressive or passive aggressive or any type of aggressive. Just a general acknowledgement of, oh, you know what, that's not really helping right now. Like, move on. Like, it doesn't need to be.
Well, I mean, the acknowledgement part is really important, though. It's sometimes I feel like there's something in back of that statement. So, why did you say that? Maybe if you address what that person is kind of thinking in a positive way, because if you just say, well, that's not relevant, then I'm feeling like you're not acknowledging me.
So maybe it's a reframing it, or, I mean, one of my personal favorites, especially when you have a lot of time, is like, this topic sounds important. It's not the topic that we're here to talk about today. But if you have time when we're done, I'm happy to chat with you for a few minutes about how to move that forward. Because that seems important. But it's not the focus of what we're meeting about today. And,
Yeah.
and those are really good at kind of neutralizing somebody, because what did you do? Well, Mary, I heard you. I acknowledged you. I'm giving you a forum afterwards to perhaps move that forward, but also doing exactly what Peyton just said is you're basically telling that person, this is not the spot for that. I hear it, but this is not the place for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I
that
do a
aggressive,
lot.
passive aggressive thing. My thought always is, if you are very upfront and open with people, very just kind of matter of fact and open. I've had many people come back and say, wow, the way you handled that was really aggressive. And I'm like, I'm sorry that you felt that way. It was not coming at you aggressively. What I was doing was trying to be very matter of fact as we
Right.
go forward.
Right.
Sometimes aggressive is the impression they get from it, not what you're putting out.
Right.
Right.
And it
I
might be
think that-
because they've never been challenged before.
Right. And I think that kind of comes back to what Carolyn was saying earlier about when you're sitting there, you're having a conversation, and oh my gosh, it literally just left my brain. But when you were saying that moving forward from it, or like trying to move on to another topic because you only have so much time to talk about something. And it's like, okay, like you're saying, Mike, just kind of directing it towards this isn't the time or the place. I think that that's a big, I'll be the first to say it, I think that's a big problem in like my generation right now. Like there's so many other things that people want to talk about and discuss for different reasons. Maybe they're beneficial to you, but maybe they're not beneficial to the group. And I think that that's really difficult to turn around and say, wait, like now is not the time for this because I only have 40 minutes to talk about the topic that I came here to discuss.
Correct.
So I definitely think that's something that I will be taking from this conversation is like how to reacclimate, and what you're saying, like maybe say, okay, can we talk about this, or can we find a time to discuss this specific portion of this topic after we've discussed what we came here to discuss?
Yeah.
I do that a lot with my
Oh,
grad
sorry. Go ahead,
students.
Vicky. Sorry.
I do that a lot with my grad students of like, I'd like to be respectful of everybody's time right now. So we're
Correct.
going to stick on this agenda topic that we've decided on.
Yeah.
And
That
maybe
we
keep
have
it for that
decided
next
on. I
one.
love that, Vicky. We have decided on this by us showing up here. We have all decided this is the topic we're going to talk about. I recognize the value of this other topic, but we as a group have decided that this is our path for today.
Yep. And when I'm teaching class and somebody's trying to derail again, I'd like to be respectful of everybody's time. Let's stick with this topic. If there's time at the end, we can discuss that further or talk to me afterwards.
I think those are great strategies. I love that. I think it's an awesome idea.
And also maybe like structuring, having more structure to the meeting and, time it.
Sometimes it's nothing more than giving a person a space to write that stuff down. I had an issue. I personally have something I want to talk about. Okay, cool. Write it down. If we have time at the end, we can certainly come to it. If we don't, let's connect about how we incorporate that into something going forward. If that makes sense for the group, if the group feels like that's valuable for us as we go forward. And constantly reminding people, and I think, again, it all depends. I think if you're in like a one-off presentation, it's harder to do those things. If you're in a coaching scenario or you're in a district or a school, those become easier because then you could say, oh, well, you know what? Why don't I come down to your room when you have some time and we can chat about this? Yeah. Bye, Carolyn. See you later. Oh, it's 1 o'clock. I didn't even realize. Why is she leaving? It's 1 o'clock. Right. Well, I didn't get a chance to share my form. Wait a second for you guys right here. So we're coming to the end of this book study. We have one more. Let me find the date. August 14th is the final book study about this book. But in the meantime, everybody who's here in the chat is a link to the form to pick the next book. What would you like to talk about next? There's some choices there. I believe there are 5 choices now. Mary, I fixed my form and I added yours to it. There are 6 choices. There you go. So we'll see what people come up with. These are books we've talked about on the town hall at one time or another. I've just been keeping a list in my Google Keep. So those are the ones we've been talking about previously. So
Yeah,
I
I
will make
keep,
sure I
I
put them.
have the Art of Coaching Teams. I keep meaning to read it.
I got to admit, Vicki, I'm happy you put that on the list because I have the same thing. I have it and I haven't read it yet. It's sitting in my little basket right over here.
Yeah,
So
I've read 2 of her other books. I keep meaning to read that one too.
Yeah. It's just sitting there. So there's some selfishness in that list too. I'm like, oh, I like that because that book is sitting in my basket too. So yeah, there's some next books for that. So again, we'll meet on the 14th in August. We'll talk about chapter 9, and then we'll talk about kind of a wrap up of this, like what can you use from this and move forward when we start back up with schools in the fall? What can you start doing? How are you going to implement some of this information? So we'll do that on the 14th. And then we'll figure out the next book and we will have that starting in September. Anything to add before we all go back to our day? It's good seeing you all. Enjoy the rest of the summer. Well, the next chunk of your summer until I see you again. I appreciate your time today and your participation. Thanks. See you soon. Have yourselves a good day.